It started on a Saturday afternoon that felt like summer was apologizing for being late. The sun wasn't just warm, it was golden, glinting off windshields, bouncing off the surface of the lake like a spotlight on nature's stage. I'd lived in the Willow Creek Estates neighborhood for almost 5 years, long enough to memorize the potholes on Magnolia Drive and which neighbors gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween. It was a quiet, semi-affluent community built around the idea of suburban tranquility. And smack in the middle of that tranquility was Lake Brighton, a smooth, oval-shaped lake surrounded by benches, well-trimmed shrubs, and a gravel walking path used mostly by retirees and moms with strollers. It was my sanctuary. That day, I grabbed my collapsible chair, my old fishing rod with the peeling cork handle, and a small cooler filled with a couple of Gatorades and a turkey sandwich. I wasn't after anything big, just some bluegill, maybe a small bass. I practiced catch and release. I even used barbless hooks to avoid hurting the fish. The act of casting my line out, hearing the gentle plop of the lure, and settling into the rhythm of nature, it was meditative, peaceful, sacred, and entirely, I thought, harmless. So you can imagine my confusion when 3 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox stamped with the Willow Creek HOA insignia. Inside was a $300 fine for unauthorized recreational activity on HOA-controlled property, citing a specific date and time, my fishing trip. I blinked at the paper. It felt like a prank. Fishing? Unauthorized? I turned it over, expecting to see some kind of clarification or maybe a misprint. There wasn't one. Just a line that said failure to pay within 14 days would result in additional penalties. At first, I genuinely believed this had to be a mistake. I'd lived there half a decade, and the lake had always been part of the community's shared amenities. I'd seen people paddle around in kayaks. I'd seen teens dangle their legs over the dock. Kids had splashed around on hot days while their parents sipped iced coffee. Fishing was no different. There weren't any no fishing signs posted. There were no rules I'd violated that I could find. So I did what any reasonable adult would do. I wrote an email. I explained that I had fished many times before, that it was a harmless and low-impact activity, and asked if perhaps there had been some new policy I'd missed. I even asked for documentation of the specific rule I had allegedly broken. The response I got was brisk and bureaucratic. It came from the HOA president herself, Brenda. Brenda had the kind of personality that could sour cream. She had assumed the HOA presidency only 8 months earlier, and in that short time, she had become infamous for her overzealous approach to community order. Lawns were inspected with measuring tape. Garbage bins left out more than 12 hours after pickup were photographed and fined. One neighbor told me Brenda once left a notice for a child's bike left unattended on a front lawn for 20 minutes. She wasn't interested in harmony. She wanted control. Her reply to me was short and smug. The rule, she said, had always existed under Section 4B of recreational land usage, which I later discovered was a vague paragraph referencing activities that may cause disruption to shared space tranquility. She interpreted that to include fishing. I asked for a meeting. She declined. I refused to pay the fine. A second notice arrived a week later, this time with an added $100 for non-compliance, and a threat that legal action would be pursued if I did not submit payment within 30 days. Now I was angry. I wasn't angry because of the money, though I wasn't thrilled about handing over $400 for the heinous crime of enjoying nature. I was angry because of the principle. I'd served in the Army Reserve. I'd worked hard to buy my home. I paid my taxes. And I believed, perhaps foolishly, in the idea that reason should prevail in a community, that people could talk, that rules should have limits. But the HOA wasn't interested in reason. It was interested in dominion. I decided to fight back. I pulled out the HOA handbook I was given when I first moved in, a thick packet no one ever reads beyond the first week. I combed through every page, every subsection, every clause and footnote. I found passages about approved flower bed widths, about shutter colors, about hedge height restrictions. But nothing, absolutely nothing, about fishing. There was a paragraph about water access and safety recommendations, but no bans. No specific prohibitions. I documented this and emailed Brenda again. No response. Instead, a week later, laminated "No fishing" signs appeared at 4 points around the lake, zip-tied to posts and trees like a crime scene. I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because the pettiness had finally made itself visible. I talked to some of my neighbors, first just a few people I knew from block parties or weekend chats. Turns out, Brenda's iron rule hadn't spared anyone. One family had received a violation for using solar-powered pathlights that disrupted uniform nighttime visibility. A Vietnam vet down the street had a flagpole that exceeded height limits by 6 inches and was told to take it down or face a lien. Even the neighborhood kids weren't safe. A sidewalk chalk drawing was once reported as graffiti. People were angry, but they felt helpless. That's the word I kept hearing, helpless. But I didn't feel helpless. Not anymore. What changed? A conversation at the county clerk's office. I'd gone down there on a hunch. Something had been bothering me. Everyone kept saying the lake was HOA controlled, but nowhere in the handbook was it clearly defined as such. I asked the clerk for the parcel history of the lake, and she printed out a few pages after some typing. And that's when I saw it. Lake Brighton wasn't owned by Willow Creek Estates. It was never turned over to the HOA. Instead, it was part of a land acquisition from the late 90s by a holding company, Brighton Properties, LLC, a commercial real estate group that had gone defunct but still maintained inactive ownership of a few leftover parcels, including this lake. I asked the obvious question, so who actually owns it? The clerk leaned over the counter and pointed at the record. Technically, Brighton's successor, a shell corporation that took over the liquidated assets. But no, the HOA doesn't own it. It doesn't belong to the neighborhood. My mind exploded. This entire time, Brenda had been enforcing rules over land she didn't legally control. That lake wasn't community property. It was orphaned real estate. A forgotten asset. And that meant one thing. It could be bought. I drove home in a daze. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The lake was about 5 acres of water, surrounded by roughly 2 more acres of shoreline, mostly accessible from the community walking path. Everyone assumed it was theirs. But it wasn't. I called the asset management firm listed as the current trustee. They told me they'd inherited it during a portfolio cleanup, and that it was considered non-performing. It had no current development value, no rental income, and they were still paying tax on it. I asked if they'd ever considered selling. The guy on the phone almost laughed. "You want to buy the lake?" he said. "We've been trying to offload that property for 6 years. Make an offer." So I did. I had a modest inheritance from my grandfather that I hadn't touched in years. I was never quite sure what to do with it. College was long paid for, and I didn't have kids. I'd always assumed I'd eventually invest it. This felt like an investment. Not in money, but in principle. Within 3 weeks, after negotiating the closing terms and transferring the funds through my attorney, I became the legal owner of Lake Brighton. Me. The guy they fined for fishing. I held the deed in my hand, printed on off-white paper with gold trim, and laughed for the first time in a month. Not out of frustration, but pure disbelief. I now owned the very body of water the HOA tried to fine me for using. I now had legal control over who could or couldn't access its shores, its waters, and its trails. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I wanted to wait for the perfect moment. So I attended the next HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a building decorated like an insurance office in a strip mall. Brenda sat at the front table with her usual clipboard and carefully typed agenda. When resident comments opened up, I raised my hand. "Yes, Mr. Carson?" Brenda said, lips already tight. "I have a question," I said. "Can the HOA confirm legal ownership of Lake Brighton?" Brenda didn't hesitate. "The HOA maintains and manages Lake Brighton as part of our shared-use recreational assets." "That's not what I asked," I replied. "I asked if the HOA owns it." A few murmurs spread through the room. Brenda's smile flickered. "Ownership is complicated. It falls under common community property." "Actually, it doesn't," I said, pulling a copy of the deed from my folder. "As of last week, Lake Brighton is privately owned. By me." Silence. Stunned. Heavy, glorious silence. And in that silence, I smiled. 2 weeks after that, the fishing ban was quietly removed from the HOA rules. The board sent out a community-wide notice stating that certain recreational spaces previously managed by the HOA are under private ownership and therefore not subject to HOA governance. They tried to make it sound like a mutual agreement. Everyone knew it wasn't. That fall, the leaves around Lake Brighton turned gold and red like fire. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace walking along the shoreline. Not just because it was mine now, but because I'd stood up. I'd fought back in a way that didn't involve yelling or name-calling or lawsuits. I used their tools, law, ownership, documentation, and beat them at their own game. And slowly, the neighborhood changed again. Brenda resigned that winter. Citing personal health reasons and a desire to spend more time with her grandchildren, she stepped down. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. But when I saw her "for sale" sign go up on her lawn a month later, I smiled quietly. It's not about revenge. It's about reclaiming space. I never set out to be a symbol. I just wanted to fish in peace. But what I learned was that sometimes peace has to be defended, not with fists, but with facts. Not with volume, but with resolve. Buying the lake wasn't about power. It was about principle. About drawing a line and saying, "This far, no farther." Today, the lake is still private. I let my neighbors walk the trail again, but only those who ask. I even put a picnic table near the water for Elliot and his grandkids. Kids can fish on weekends if they bring their parents. There's no bureaucracy. No fines. Just respect. And me? I still fish. Same chair. Same rod. Different view. Because now, when I cast my line, I'm not just reclaiming peace. I own it. Ownership is power, but what you do with that power is what people remember. After buying Lake Brighton and winning my personal war against the HOA, I found myself in an unfamiliar position. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to rules. I was defining boundaries. Not symbolic boundaries, either. Real, legal ones, printed on deeds and backed by property law. But as I soon realized, winning the fight wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something bigger. The community began to shift. It started subtly. The foot traffic around the lake all but vanished. People who used to jog the shoreline now rerouted to the paved trails behind the tennis courts. The early morning dog walkers, who once waved at me as they passed, began giving me wide berths, part wariness, part embarrassment. It wasn't that I had done anything cruel. But in disrupting the HOA's unchecked authority, I'd unsettled the equilibrium of the neighborhood. Then came the vacancies. Brenda's resignation hit the HOA board like a dropped stone in a shallow pond. The ripples spread quickly. 2 of her longtime allies on the board, Greg and Carol, quietly announced they would not seek re-election. Their statements were vague: personal priorities, family obligations. Everyone knew better. Without Brenda's influence, their leash of control had snapped. A special election was announced to fill the vacancies, and to my surprise, several new names appeared on the ballot. These weren't just power-hungry suburbanites looking for leverage over mailbox designs. They were residents, real people, who had grown tired of the HOA's tyranny. People who'd paid quiet prices over the years. Fines for minor landscaping choices, reprimands for kids playing too loudly, and citations for parking half an inch over the driveway line. It turned out I wasn't the only one who'd had enough. One of the candidates was Dolores. Yes, Dolores, the retired schoolteacher who had spoken in my defense during the meeting that changed everything. She ran on a single brilliant campaign slogan printed in thick block letters on bright blue yard signs: "Make the HOA boring again." She won in a landslide. At the first open board meeting following the elections, the energy was entirely different. People laughed. They asked questions. They didn't whisper their frustrations in corners. They said them aloud. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't a symbol of dread. It was, oddly, functional. And just like that, something shifted in me. I realized I didn't want to simply own the lake and retreat into it like a fortress. I wanted to be part of something better. That's when Elliot approached me with a proposition. "You should join the HOA committee," he said one afternoon, handing me a beer across his back fence. "Not as a board member. As part of the review committee. Help rewrite the rules." I stared at the bottle in my hand, unsure whether I was being invited into a trap or a revolution. "Elliot, I just spent 6 months fighting these people. I'm not looking to draft bylaws." "Exactly," he said. "That's why you should. You know what it feels like to be on the wrong side of a stupid rule." He had a point. So I joined the HOA Rules and Governance Review Committee. The meetings were held every other Wednesday evening in the community clubhouse. Gone were the stiff formalities and awkward silence. We brought coffee, baked goods. One guy brought his dog, a floppy golden retriever named Simon, who became our unofficial mascot. And together, we combed through every line of the HOA's covenants, rules, and enforcement policies. Some of the stuff was ludicrous. There was a clause requiring that all holiday decorations be removed within 72 hours of the date of the holiday unless an extension is granted. Another rule limited garage sale signage to a size no greater than 18 inches wide and posted no earlier than 6 a.m. One particularly absurd passage outlined permitted curtain colors for street-facing windows. We rewrote all of it. Instead of micromanaging aesthetics, we focused on safety, fairness, and actual community standards. Noise restrictions were made clearer but more flexible. Lawn height standards were reasonable and easy to maintain. We replaced punitive fines with polite reminders and education. Most importantly, we created a process that allowed residents to appeal citations without hiring a lawyer or enduring months of bureaucratic nonsense. The fishing ban? Gone. Removed from every version of the rules with unanimous approval. Once the new bylaws were ratified and mailed to every household, the neighborhood changed again. This time, for the better. People smiled more. There was a strange sense of relief in the air, as though the entire community had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. For the first time since I moved into Willow Creek Estates, I felt like I belonged. Not because I had asserted power, but because I had contributed something. But while the HOA relaxed, attention turned back to the lake. Residents began asking, gently at first, about access. Some approached me during morning walks. Others left notes on my porch or messaged me through the HOA app. Could they take their kids fishing? Could they bring a folding chair and read near the water? Could they walk the trail again? Some even offered to pay for access. I didn't want their money, so I came up with something else. I created a respect agreement. Just a one-page pledge. It wasn't a legal contract. It simply stated, I understand that Lake Brighton is private property. I pledge to treat the area with care, clean up after myself, and respect the guidelines provided by the owner. In return, I am invited to enjoy walking, fishing, and peaceful recreation along the lake. I handed them out personally. If someone signed it, I gave them a green respect card, laminated and modest. That was it. It caught on. Within weeks, over 40 residents had signed. There were no problems. People were careful. Kids picked up litter they didn't drop. Neighbors brought benches and gardening tools to improve the trail. One family even built a birdhouse near the east edge of the lake and donated seed. It became a little ecosystem of goodwill. Then came the media. A local journalist who lived in the area wrote a blog post about the man who bought the lake to fight the HOA. It went viral. A week later, a regional magazine picked it up. Soon after, I was being contacted by national outlets. I turned most of them down. I had no desire to be famous, but I agreed to one interview for a homeowners' rights podcast. That podcast episode opened the floodgates. People from across the country began contacting me. Not just to congratulate me, but to share horror stories. A woman in Arizona fined for planting drought-resistant plants instead of grass. A man in Virginia cited for parking his work truck in his driveway. A couple in Texas forced to repaint their front door 3 times because the board couldn't agree on a shade of blue. So I did something unexpected. I started a non-profit. I called it the HOA Watchdog. Its mission was simple: empower homeowners with knowledge, connect them to legal resources, and shine a light on unfair practices. I used a portion of the inheritance I hadn't touched to get things started. Hired a part-time legal advisor. Built a website. Created downloadable guides like Know Your HOA Contract and How to Dispute a Fine Without Going Broke. The response was overwhelming. Within a month, the site had thousands of visits. Within 2, I was getting letters, real letters, from people who had found the courage to stand up for themselves. Not everyone could buy a lake, of course. But they could attend meetings. They could ask questions. They could organize votes. They could push back. Back in Willow Creek, I was still just the guy with the fishing chair. But now, people stopped to thank me. A retired veteran shook my hand and told me he no longer felt like a prisoner in his own home. A single mom said she finally let her kids play outside without fear of getting a violation notice for sidewalk chalk. At the next neighborhood picnic, I was asked to speak. I kept it short. I didn't buy the lake out of spite, I told them. I bought it because I was tired of being told I couldn't enjoy something peacefully. All I ever wanted was to fish in quiet and be left alone. But in fighting for that, I realized we'd all been robbed of something bigger, our sense of ownership, not over property, but over our lives. Applause. Real, honest applause. Not out of politeness, but appreciation. The HOA remained functional. The new board was transparent and kind. Rules existed, yes, but they made sense. The respect card became a sort of legend, with neighbors joking about trading them like rare Pokemon. Elliot got a bench named after him. Dolores, now chair of the board, sent me Christmas cookies with a card that read, "You could have scorched the earth. Instead, you planted trees." I still fish most mornings. Same chair. Same rod. But now, sometimes I'm joined by others. A kid learning to cast. A retiree with his coffee. Even Helen, once an HOA hardliner, sits nearby and reads from time to time. I smile every time. Because what started as a fight became a foundation. A story not just of rebellion, but restoration. Not just of ownership, but community. Not just of justice, but grace. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not that I banned the HOA from the lake, but that I showed them, showed all of us, what it could mean to belong to a place without being controlled by it. To cast a line into still water and know, deep in your bones,